Okay, in this video, I'd like to introduce you to a brand new, very exciting and pivotal concept when it comes to programming. And this is the concept known as conditionals. Previously, we've seen that Ruby implements and executes each line from top to bottom, one line at a time, like clockwork. With conditionals, however, we unlock the power to skip certain lines of code. We're going to start by demonstrating this in the abstract and eventually move towards more realistic examples. So let's start writing some code. We're going to create a variable called Joyce and set it to hold the number 10. And now we are going to write our first conditional. If Joyce is greater than 5, then let's display the number 100 to the terminal. And then we will type in end. Let's go through this one line at a time. Line 1 is straightforward. We set a variable called Joyce and have it hold the number 10. Line 2 is where we begin the conditional. The conditional is a block of code that goes from the if statement on line 2 down to the end statement on line 4. Now let's read line 2 carefully. If the contents of Joyce is greater than the number 5, then and only then is Ruby going to execute the code in between the if statement and the end statement. So Ruby is going to check what the contents of Joyce is. And if those contents are greater than 5, then we will move on to line 3 and display the number 100 to the terminal. If, however, the contents of Joyce is not greater than 5, we are going to skip over the contents between the if and the end. And the number 100 will not end up being displayed in the terminal. Now in this case, since Joyce is indeed greater than 5, as it is 10, when we run this code, the number 100 will be displayed in the terminal. Let's see that. Okay, so we get the number 100. But let's change the variable Joyce to be, let's say, 2 rather than 10. Now, when we hit the play button, we see that nothing gets displayed to the terminal. Because now on the if statement on line 2, when it says if Joyce is greater than 5, then execute line 3, in this case Joyce is not greater than 5, it is less than 5, and therefore Ruby skips over line 3 and does not display the number 100 to the terminal. Now we can actually put multiple lines of code between the if statement and the end statement. So we can print 200 and 300. Now again, when we hit the play button, nothing gets displayed because since Joyce is 2, on line 2, when we say if Joyce is greater than 5, since Joyce is not greater than 5, we skip over all the lines of code until the end statement. So lines 3, 4, and 5 get totally skipped over. If, however, we would change Joyce back to 10 and hit the play button, then, when Ruby hits line 2 and says if Joyce is greater than 5, since Joyce is indeed greater than 5, we then proceed to execute all the lines of code, top to bottom, between the if and the end, so we display the numbers 100 and then 200 and 300 to the terminal. Now let's put a line of code beyond the end statement and say print 1000. When we run this code, we can see that the numbers 100, 200, 300, and 1000 get displayed to the terminal. Again, this makes sense because let's imagine that we are the computer executing these lines of code from top to bottom. On line 1, Joyce is 10. On line 2, if Joyce is greater than 5, Joyce is greater than 5. So we move on to execute lines 3, 4, and 5 and display the numbers 100, 200, 300 respectively to the terminal. We hit the end block, and then we proceed as usual to line 7 and display the number 1000 to the terminal. But let's say we made the Joyce variable hold the number 2 rather than the number 10 and hit the play button. Only the number 1000 gets displayed to the terminal. Again, the way we analyze this is that on line 1 we set the Joyce variable to be the number 2. On line 2 we say if Joyce is greater than 5, Joyce is not greater than 5. So we skip over all the lines of code between the if statement and the end statement on line 6. However, once we've gotten over this entire conditional, Ruby then moves on, like it normally does, one line of code top to bottom. So it proceeds and does indeed execute line 7, and therefore displays the number 1000 to the terminal, which is what we see below. As these examples get more complex, it becomes increasingly useful to use the Peter-Jang notation to track what's going on. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with the example of when Joyce is actually 10. We are going to use the first part of the Peter-Jang notation simply to track the order of the lines of code that get executed. So on line 1, that is the first line that gets executed. Line 2 gets executed. If Joyce is greater than 5, Joyce is greater than 5. So line 3 gets executed. Line 4 gets executed. Line 5 gets executed. The end statement gets executed. And then finally, line 7 gets executed. Again, this is super straightforward, but things get trickier when we change the Joyce variable to hold the number 2. Let's do that. So we'll change that to 2. Let's go ahead and clear these notations. So we start with line number 1. This line gets hit. We set the Joyce variable to be the number 2. Line number 2 gets hit because Ruby has to analyze this if statement, if Joyce is greater than 5. So that line gets hit. But since Joyce is not greater than 5, since Joyce actually holds the number 2, we end up skipping over lines 3, 4, and 5. So the next line that actually gets hit is line 6. So we're going to indicate this with the comment of 3 to indicate that line 6 is the third line of code that gets run. And then finally, line 7 is the fourth line of code that gets run. So when we employ the Peter-Jang notation, it becomes very easy to see how certain lines of code actually get skipped over by the computer.